I'm going to be very quick. My job is really actually to moderate today's discussion, but one of the reasons I know I was chosen is because of my work branching across geographic bounds, but also scales. And I think Mitu has certainly talked about a couple of very pressing issues with respect to the future goals. In addition to the imprecision of the notion of sustainability, there's also the imprecision of the tangibility of what's created in New York or at the United Nations and how that resonates with individuals on the ground. And I know that today, after the panelists speak, I'll probably flag a few questions that I think are interesting or worthy of consideration. But mostly my job today is to listen, keep time, and hope that you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. I guess, does it matter which order we start with? Okay. So maybe Hayden, can we start with you?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Round of applause for Chris Gore. Hanin Bojo, Bimwewadem, Indigenous Cause, Makwa, Indodem, Chimnasing, and Danjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. Thanks for the introduction. I'm an Anishinaabe scholar here at Ryerson, so the bulk of my work focuses on philosophy, political theory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Anishinaabe philosophy and theory, and maybe Indigenous theory generally, or philosophy, I should say, when it comes to the economy, the environment. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the international community has attempted to manage climate change and the consequences of that management or attempted management on Indigenous peoples. But before well, I guess this is part of my presentation. I guess I want to start with a story. And this is a story that I learned as a young man, and it's a story that we tell in our communities, in Anishinaabe communities. It's one of the most well-known stories that we have, and it's the story of the moose thief. So one day the people were, as they are every day, practicing economic activity, harvesting animals to eat, killing animals to eat. And they couldn't find the deer, they couldn't find the moose. They had vanished. And so the people attempted to find the deer and the moose, and they searched for days and days, and they actually searched for weeks, until they finally realized that the crows and the owls had kidnapped the deer and the moose. And they took a war to the crows and the owls to free the deer and the moose, and this war lasted for weeks, lasted for months, until finally they got close enough to the deer and the moose, and they asked them, or they told them, "Let's go, you're free." And the deer and the moose had told the people that they went with the owls and the crows willingly. They hadn't been kidnapped. They had abandoned the humans because people had forgotten their obligations, and they had forgotten their responsibility to the deer and the moose. And those obligations were two, primarily. The first is to promise not to waste their flesh. The second is to ensure the maintenance of their homes and their societies. And humans had forgotten that teaching, they had forgotten that promise, they had forgotten that obligation that they had made with the deer and the moose. And so they suffered for it. So this is, we've come to know this as a treaty, our treaty with the deer and the moose, and we have treaties, Anishinaabe peoples have treaties with the muskrat and the beaver, with the fish, multiple species of fish. And these bind us, these bind our relationships to these animals, and they bind our relationship to the land. Now, I'm telling this story because it's the root or the heart of Anishinaabe philosophy when it comes to economic development or just a relationship with the land generally. Now, this is not an altruistic philosophy. When we think about economic development among humans generally, I mean, we're exploiting the land. This is a self-interested practice. This is for our own survival. This is development. But in the Anishinaabe perspective, we lack, or our stories tell us that we should lack, entitlement. So this might differ from traditional notions of development and using the land in productive ways. We are not entitled to use the land unless we provide something in exchange. So this is a very foundational principle of reciprocity. We cannot go around destroying the land, depleting animal resources, water resources, agricultural resources, without giving something back. And sometimes, and in some Indigenous philosophies, that giving back might be simple as an offering of tobacco. But more often than not, it's more significant than that. It's maintaining, it's sustaining ecosystems, sustaining the land, not, you know, so we can exploit it longer, which is how we seem to talk about sustainability today, but that it maintains, that it lasts forever. And so when we think about development, we cannot be undertaking development if it's going to adversely harm another species, another creature that we share the land with. We'll be sacrificing our responsibilities and our obligations, and it'll eventually be our own demise. And there's a really simple underlying principle behind this philosophy. I mean, if you kill that which sustains you, you yourself die. And remarkably, humans elsewhere have not been able to grasp this very simple concept. So the first problem when we're thinking about sustainability and sustainable development is this problem of seemingly unmitigated economic development, or economic development, poverty reduction, without acknowledging the rights of other species, the rights of the land, and the responsibilities that we have towards them. The second problem, and I guess this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of my talk, although my few minutes of my talk, are about the attempts that the United Nations and states have undertaken to achieve sustainable development. We're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals here, or this is one of the specific points of discussion here. Indigenous peoples, despite the rhetoric, aren't really involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is the second problem. Indigenous peoples are absent. Now, the first issue is that Indigenous peoples often are not represented by states. They might cross state borders. They might have political communities that do not resemble states in any way. States are actively suppressing Indigenous communities. So non-state entities speaking at the international level, particularly through the UN, is often challenging. Now, their opinion has been taken into account. In fact, at the June working group on the Sustainable Development Goals, Indigenous peoples did have a chance to speak, and this was their statement. You do not have to turn your back on us. You can still take our hand and include us in the journey of the next 15 years. We can make valuable contributions. Don't leave us behind. They weren't able to make this statement because of time constraints. So the process, the consultation for the SDGs has been woefully inadequate in regards to including Indigenous perspectives. And one of the reasons, among many, that why it's so critical to include Indigenous perspectives, certainly there's the philosophical aspect, but there's also the damage that conservation and sustainable development does to Indigenous peoples. And I'll focus on conservation. It seems to me, and my colleagues can probably correct me on this point if I'm wrong, that the primary mechanism through which we mitigate development is conservation. So whether it's carbon trading and developing carbon sinks to absorb carbon to offset development, conservation, the creation of national state parks is a widespread phenomenon in these attempts at sustainable development. The problem is they also expel Indigenous peoples in extremely high numbers. In Africa alone, up to 14 million Indigenous peoples have been forced from the land to create national or state parks. The very first parks in the United States, Yellowstone, were created by expelling the Miwok and the Shoshone. The very first parks in Canada were created by expelling Indigenous peoples, the Anishinaabe from Quetico Provincial Park in southwestern Ontario. Conservation has become such a challenge for Indigenous peoples. Expulsion from their traditional territories has been such a challenge for Indigenous peoples, they have vocally expressed this dissatisfaction or anger. In 2003, at the 5th World Parks Conference in Congress in South Africa, Indigenous delegates drafted a statement that read in part, "First, we are dispossessed in the name of kings and emperors, later in the name of state development, and now in the name of conservation." In the following year at the International Forum on Mapping in Vancouver, every single Indigenous representative, over 200 present, signed a statement claiming that conservation has become the #1 threat to Indigenous peoples. So part of the philosophy guiding conservation has been that no people exist in these national state territorial parks, because, and maybe rightly so, the belief is that humans are the ones causing significant damage to ecosystems, to species, to watersheds, except Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples' philosophy, and I shouldn't say that, I don't want to generalize, not all Indigenous peoples, but Indigenous peoples have a belief that we are a part of ecosystems, not separate from them. We need to think of our place in ecology and on the land in radically different ways. And so by expelling Indigenous peoples, we start breaking down the philosophy that has guided some of these communities that have been able to manage the land for thousands of years successfully and sustainably in a true sustainable fashion. So conservation, so the practice of how we practice conservation has been incredibly detrimental. How we continue to practice conservation has been incredibly detrimental for Indigenous peoples. And so again, I said it comes back to philosophy, and we need to think about philosophy and about ecology and environment in radically different ways. And for Anishinaabe peoples, we have a concept called Mana Bimadiziwin. And Mana Bimadiziwin kind of means the intersection of economy and ecology. Directly translated, it means the good life, cyclical and reciprocal reproduction. So it's continual rebirth. These are the types of concepts I think that we need to employ when we're rethinking sustainability beyond 2015 or otherwise. We have to rethink poverty reduction strategies that rely exclusively on harmful development. We need to rethink models of conservation that evict Indigenous peoples or evict peoples generally. And if we as non-native peoples or non-native states are not interested in thinking 7 generations into the future on every decision we make, then maybe just make space for Indigenous peoples. Give them something like free, prior, and informed consent, which is an article in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Indigenous peoples struggle to get into the Sustainable Development Goals. Free, prior, and informed consent simply means on Indigenous territories where they're lucky enough to have some degree of tenure, any development project they essentially have a veto on. That would go a long way in allowing Indigenous peoples to survive and allowing some of these, as far as I'm concerned, sophisticated and simple philosophies about how to live and work on the land. So Chimigwich.
I'm going to situate a lot of my comments around my area of specialty, which is environmental justice. So for those of you who aren't familiar with environmental justice, it basically suggests that racialized people, Indigenous people, bear the burden of environmental risks when there are risks. And it also sort of draws attention to the fact that notions of the environment are often really narrowly defined, right? So we do tend to think of green spaces as opposed to thinking about urban spaces and how they may impact on marginalized groups. There's also a sense of looking at how the environment tends to be represented and who tends to be included or excluded from these dominant representations. Now, in terms of thinking about climate change and issues of inequality, the sense I have a lot of the times when I'm talking to my students about climate change is that there's, it seems like one of these sort of huge mega problems, that it's, vast in scope, that, there's a lot of eco-hype about it, and it becomes difficult then to sort of think about the sort of starting point to do this sort of work. But I think a lot of the recent reactions coming out of the 2014 United Nations Climate Change Summit and the street protests that have been happening point to the fact that climate change is affecting everyone and that it's happening now. But in terms of those who are going to be most likely to be affected, and what I'm suggesting isn't new, is this that the effects of climate change are not equally distributed. So in terms of those in the global south and marginalized people locally that share a lot in common, what we're seeing in terms of the effects of climate change right now is already concerns for drinking water, increased disease, concerns about disruptions to agriculture, which are having food security issues. And as a result, there's an increase in problems related to climate refugees, without there being any language right now within the UN Convention on Refugees to allow for climate change refugees. So in terms of the sort of challenges of these groups moving forward, what we've already been sort of seeing is the fact that the burden that is borne on marginalized communities locally and globally tends to be exasperated because of the limited disaster response capacities that exist in a lot of communities in the global south and locally. And what happens then is when climate change tends to affect these communities, it tends to drain the limited resources that they already have. In addition, in terms of the inequalities, vulnerable groups tend to be disadvantaged in terms of these policy arenas and being able to participate in the discussions that inevitably will affect them. And this tends to be problematic given that, as was highlighted by Mitu in her introductory comments, that it is more developed countries that are responsible for 45% of the global carbon emissions. And then in addition to the environmental risks that are disproportionately borne by marginalized groups, they're also dealing with high levels of poverty and hunger, high levels of gender inequality. So just in terms of sort of presenting that problematic, what I would like to sort of suggest to you or open up in terms of avenues for where we can possibly go in terms of sustainable development frameworks, or what I'd like to talk about as climate justice, post-2015, is to perhaps think about the following. First of all, in terms of, as I said, there isn't really any language or policy that allows for climate refugees right now. So to change the UN Convention so that climate refugees are being recognized and they're not being turned away or being encouraged to reframe their issues as being economic. The next thing is to think about shifting towards mandatory carbon emissions or energy descent plans. And that these should be borne disproportionately, as has been argued before in terms of sustainable development initiatives, by more developed countries that are responsible for these emissions in the first place. In terms of my own work, I tend to advocate towards carbon taxes. And then lastly, there's a need for greater collaboration. So much of the work around climate change and environmental issues tends to operate within sort of silos. And I see the issues related to climate change and environmental justice as affecting planning, health, and education. So as we move forward for solutions, we really need to sort of think in terms of multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder collaboration that allows for climate change adaptation preparedness strategies. So we start to sort of think, how do we prepare for these problems in advance? Both locally and globally, in keeping with the precautionary principle, recognizing preparing now will actually allow for us to be able to respond better in the future. Thank you.
Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, as presented by the UN Open Working Group, really represent nothing less than a vision of a good society. And I think that if many of us were to sit around a table and pose the question, what kind of world do we want to live in, we would come up with something pretty similar to that of the UN Working Group. You know, we'd want a world in which there is the end of poverty. We want economic growth, which creates good jobs, but at the same time is sustainable. We like greater equality. We like peace and social justice. This is what we get from the UN Open Working Group. And although one has to be skeptical about the great number of goals, I think 17 and 109 targets, there are two very good things about the Sustainable Development Goals, I think. One, I think Mitu suggested one of them, but I think there are two. The first is the universal responsibility which the Sustainable Development Goals impose, so that industrial countries no longer get a free pass. The goals are meant for everyone, not just for the developed world. That's very good. And the second thing, which is very important, is that sustainability is brought into the very discussion of economic growth, poverty reduction, and equality. And that's a very good thing too, because obviously if there's greater equality, then it's much easier to fight poverty given a certain level of economic growth. So there are all kinds of good reasons why it's a good idea to try and bring together these various factors. Well, of course, the main problem with the, as I see it, of the Sustainable Development Goals is that it's necessarily a technocratic exercise. It's people getting together in the United Nations, setting up all these goals and targets. And the problem, of course, is that it's good to think about what the good society is, but if we're just talking about unrealizable utopia, then it's really a waste of time, isn't it? So the real question is political feasibility. You know, how do you go about actually creating a situation in which these kind of goals can be realized? So what I'd like to do very briefly is to really address this question. The question is, what are the politics of taking sustainability seriously? I think that takes us very far afield. And what I'm going to focus on very briefly is the national level of politics. And of course, global politics, a global agreement on, for example, climate change is very, very important. But I think there's a very close interconnection between change at the national level and change at the global level. So that, for example, to the extent you have progressive governments in many countries of the West, or also of the South as well, there is more of a symbiotic relationship created with global level social movements which are also pressing for sustainability and the various other goals put forward by the Sustainable Development Committee. So that this symbiosis between the national governments and the global movements, I think, is what we need to think of in moving ahead to try and realize some of these very wide-ranging goals. So I want to today really to just address three linked questions without in any sense trying to provide a kind of complete or definitive analysis, but rather more modestly just raise issues for discussion later on today. The first question is, can we achieve the social development goals within the existing order, or will systemic change be needed? Now, my view is that the Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the committee, or even as amended by the UN later on, are so fundamentally at loggerheads with the power structures and the prevailing neoliberal development paradigm that systemic change is really required. Now, there are techno-optimists, as you know, who say that, you know, technology, there'll be a technological fix for climate change and some of the other problems of sustainability. But I think that we would be, should be very cautious in accepting that kind of optimism. It is unlikely that there will be a painless way of creating a sustainable economy. So we have to accept that it's going to be a very painful process in the next few years. In terms of the interests of dominant classes, one just has to look at two of the Sustainable Development Goals to understand how enormous a challenge to existing vested interests are actually exist within these two goals. First, inequalities of wealth and income, which the UN group talks about. Of course, they're growing in many countries, including Canada and globally. Now, you've heard all kinds of statistics. I'll just give you one from a 2014 Oxfam report just out. So the Oxfam report estimates that 1% of the world's population controlled in 2013 110 trillion in wealth, which was 65 times the total wealth controlled by the bottom half of the world's poor. That is 3.5 million people, 3.5 billion people. So reversing inequality means that the most powerful groups in our society, which today would be in the financial sector primarily and also in the energy sector, would have to surrender a great deal of their wealth and also, and as a result, also political influence. Second, preventing irreversible climate change requires vast changes in production, consumption, and energy use, as we know from the successive reports of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the message is loud and clear from these intergovernmental panels. Been going on now for several years, many reports. The message is the globe is warming, human activity is mainly responsible, and we must act quickly to avoid catastrophic climate change. We have really only a couple of decades, perhaps, to get our house in order if we are to keep the total increase in global warming to 2 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial level. And that really is only, at the most, a couple of decades. The problem is, of course, that greenhouse gas emissions are still increasing, not declining. Well, what needs to be done to deal with this issue? Now, I think the most conservative estimate is that of the actually Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which tries to be very conservative in how it presents its case. It is a consensus among hundreds of climate scientists. The claim in the most recent report is that limiting the temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius would require a worldwide reduction of 40 to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions over current levels by 2050. And that means that between 60 and 80% of existing reserves of fossil fuels would need to stay in the ground. Now, does anyone believe that this magnitude of change can actually, in terms of just equality and climate change, just two of the goals of this committee, does anybody believe that this level of change can actually happen within the existing neoliberal order? We begin with some of the world's largest and most profitable corporations would be threatened with bankruptcy unless they quickly adapted to the new changes. And dealing with the problems of inequality and ecological decline will involve, however done, a directive, proactive state to set standards that curtail markets. This approach contradicts the neoliberal tenet that the common good is best served if markets are as self-regulating as possible. Hence, there would be, and there is, powerful, politically entrenched opposition to overcome. Just consider, for example, the deadlock in the US today between the Republicans and the Democrats over any discussion of climate change or any other major issue on the agenda. The second question is, what sort of system change is needed? Is it an alternative to capitalism or an alternative within capitalism? To simplify the discussion of this very, very complex question, let's discuss the question only in relation to climate change, which is a major threat to our future existence. Now, the eco-socialists and Marxists are absolutely clear in their position. Capitalism is incompatible with sustainability. In the words of one of the books titled, "The End of Capitalism or the End of the World." I love that title. The general argument of eco-socialists is that an inner logic of capitalism drives a process of unending commodification and accumulation, which eventually leads to ecological disaster. Now, what is this inner logic? There are actually, I found, 5 versions of this inner logic. They're all complex, so all I can do is just mention them in passing. First, wants are insatiable in capitalism, owing not only to slick advertising, but also to the association in popular culture between wealth and consumption on the one hand, and well-being and happiness on the other. Secondly, competition among firms is based on the logic of grow or die. Firms that do not grow cannot repay their debts, they lose shareholder value, and are subject to takeovers and bankruptcy. Thus, firms seek to grow no matter what. Thirdly, the short time horizon of corporate and political leaders drives them to avoid supposedly costly reforms aimed at preserving the environment in the longer term. And finally, capitalism involves the commodification of nature, which transforms forests, geological features, animals, lakes, landscapes, etc., into, quote, natural capital, which justifies the exploitation of nature for profit, which ultimately leads to the degradation of nature. I think these four understandings of the inner logic of capitalism are really very powerful and quite accurate. But the problem is that if the solution, if the new world we want to create requires a change of the system, presumably to socialism, then I think we're in deep trouble, because for two reasons, basically. First of all, people in many countries are highly skeptical of socialism, given the experience of socialism in the before 1990, in the 20th century especially, and therefore are going to be difficult to mobilize for what many will regard as a leap in the dark. And secondly, we don't really have any clear idea of how to create a socialist society. Whatever path is chosen, there would lead to decades of chaos and conflict as we try and sort out our society. And we simply don't have decades to waste in this kind of enterprise. But I think the situation is not so dire as the eco-socialists and Marxists claim. Yes, there are real and dangerous tendencies within capitalism. Yes, if capitalism is left to itself, it would destroy nature. However, capitalism is not as it's not as irremediable as these people think, in my estimation. They have a view of capitalism as being unable to deal with the kind of challenges brought before them. I think that capitalism has actually shown itself to be an enormously adaptable doctrine. It has happened before that capitalism had to be saved from itself. For example, in the Great Depression in the 1930s, with the advent of Keynesian ideas in 1936 and thereafter into the Second World War and the post-war period, there was the movement towards a very egalitarian and prosperous world for 25 years following World War II. So there's a very adaptable doctrine. I mean, who in the years of the First World War could ever have imagined there could be the social democratic welfare state of the 1960s and 70s, especially in Scandinavia, but also elsewhere? This was an era which Marx said would lead to immiseration, and in fact that didn't happen. In short, it seems to me that there is a progressive movement within capitalism that we can take that will allow us to attain sustainable development. And what I'm referring to, I call very generally green social democracy. I don't have time to obviously define this complex system here, but we're talking about a kind of a political system in which there's a primacy of politics over markets, a deepening of democracy, equality as an important goal, and a proactive democratic state acting to advance the common interest, partly by taming disruptive market forces. The common interest, in the case of green social democracy, includes sustainability among other goals, such as equality, poverty, elimination, and prosperity. And I think that there are two reasons why this kind of system could work in dealing with the issues of sustainability. The first reason is that the most progressive social democracies in the world today have the best environmental record, bar none. Yale University has done a very detailed study of governmental rectitude in the environmental realm, when they're able to rank countries. All the first 6, for example, are all social democracy, and not just in the industrial world. Also, Costa Rica is there, and Mauritius just down below. The social democracies in the third world are also among the most, showing the most rectitude when it comes to environmental sustainability. So that's one very positive thing. On the other hand, the most neoliberal governments have the worst record, and they're going down year by year as well, like the United States, for example, and Canada, of course, as a prime example. And secondly, the second reason why this kind of movement can work is that social democracy has this notion of the primacy of politics over markets, and a belief in deep democracy. And this provides a way of countering the economic power of corporations, which underpins the present neoliberal regime, and it has to be basically overcome before we can attain, it seems to me, a sustainable society. I have more here, but I don't have time to do it because I only have 1 minute left. So in conclusion, I would like to say, many of us want a new policy paradigm that sees a democratized state as a defender of the common good, that has a broader notion of human well-being than the current focus on individual material gain, and that sees ecological sustainability as a fundamental value. But we know it is very difficult to break with business as usual. 2 things are needed: the formulation of a coherent alternative policy paradigm to neoliberalism that places the environment at its center, and secondly, grassroots mobilization to build support for this paradigm and drive change at the national and ultimately global levels. Thus, it seems to me if we take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously, we face a formidable political agenda. Thank you.
So first, a very warm thank you to our speakers. I just want to make a few remarks and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I think with respect to the schedule today, around 4:45, we'll be taking a break for more food or snacks. And then after that, Stephen Lewis, I think, is expected to be speaking. I think one of the things that's very valuable or opportunity to listen instead of formally present is to see the connections between speakers. And one of there's a couple that I see quite clearly, but also in a very, I guess, in a complicated manner as well. The clarity is the relationship between pragmatism, I see it, pragmatism and values. That we hear amongst all 3 speakers is that if we have an agreement about potential values of which kind of society we want to function in, the question then becomes about the pragmatism or the practical or policy challenges of implementing those and embedding those into a type of order, structure, system in which we want to function in. So Hayden refers to the role of engagement and the notion of values, and one of the challenges is always about accommodation. We ask the question of, well, under what conditions and what's good enough consultation? Well, some consultation is better than none, but that doesn't mean it's good. We can see that in environmental assessment processes. We can see that in any logic of a policy development process. The issue of climate refugees, I think, is an excellent example. And the question is, well, why hasn't the definition been taken up? Well, largely it's a pragmatic challenge. Well, what happens if? If we open up the definition, then what's the implication for states? I mean, how do you define what a climate refugee is? How do we reach agreement? I think one of the things that's so instrumental to think about here is that we have to start thinking about how those values become not conundrums that we sully our time over, and most importantly, that we don't use the speed and policy structures or political structures as arguments for why compromise is needed. And so when we talk about the values we want to live in, whether it's green social democracy or whether it's some other structure, we often find at the root of debates is, well, we don't have time, it's too complicated, or the structures don't presently exist in order to do that, but we still need to take action. So should we rush ahead and get halfway there, and then someday it'll show up? Or do we have to start thinking more carefully about how those values become embedded very seriously in the structures, and how those values actually become embedded with some legitimacy and some strength. And I end with an example from Tanzania. So this past summer, part of research I was doing in Dar es Salaam. So one of the things I'm very interested in is food security and local populations adapting to climate change. So a part of the city that's very low-lying, and Dar es Salaam is very, very low-lying, the people had presented this example to me as a population who had adapted to climate change impacts. Well, what had they done? They had built walls surrounding their houses, bordering a creek. So they're in a low-lying area. They had built rise-up walls, like sort of walls around the outside of their houses. So on one level, people are presenting this saying, isn't this innovative and isn't this interesting, and look at this adaptation. You say, well, yes. But then the argument is, of course, this isn't adaptation at all. This is coping. Right? This is responding to an emergency and events about all sorts of problems that are encountered. And the interesting thing about language is that it really matters. Because when we're presenting this as examples of adaptation, it gives a sense of something embedded systemically with support, with structure. But the reality, of course, is that wasn't at all what was happening. They were responding to climate change, but they were responding because it was a livelihood need to do so. So on level, the perception of where you're coming from, the structure in which you're set, really has extraordinary influence on the kind of response that materializes. And I study the relationship between the local all the way to the global. And one of the things in the Canadian context that's so remarkable is that over 65% of the Canadian population lives in a city that has done something to address climate change, both mitigate it and increasingly adapt to it. That's an extraordinary number of people, extraordinary. Yet at the national level, and even the provincial level, response has been much weaker than what's happening at the local scale. So the question is, well, why is there this disconnect between what's happening at the local level, the desire, the demand, the interest, and the national? And that's not an answer that I'm going to give you, but one of the things I find so interesting is that these assumptions of roles and responsibilities and duties are both value questions, but also, most importantly, pragmatic questions. And I think it's instrumental for us, hopefully today, to raise questions about not only the values we want to abide by, but how those values become more embedded into the structures in which we wish to function. I think we now have about a half an hour to take questions, and I think open for discussion. Just a second. I have one microphone here. Mitu, is there more than one, or is it just one microphone? It's a small space, so if I could ask you to stand up. I'm not sure, are you recording the questions? Okay. So I'm happy to try to run around with the microphone if we can. Can I make a couple of observations? First is, given the number of people, could you please ask a question and make sure that question is certainly as concise as possible. The second is, if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. And the third is, if you have a question directed to one individual in particular on the panel, if you could state who that is. And if we need to take a few questions at the same time, then we'll do that. So.
I'm Judy Velland. I'm with a neighborhood environmental group called Green Neighbors 21. My question is, would somebody on the panel take a stab at defining sustainability?
No, we don't. Why don't you let Hayden look at
Sure. Well, from my perspective, I don't think that there is. I really don't think there can be a universal definition of sustainability. I mean, my definition of sustainability is probably going to be a lot different from most other people's definition of sustainability. Sustainability means, the ability to exploit the land to a point so that it's not going to irreversibly harm another creature's ability to survive as well. So, putting that into practice or operation when we're thinking about things like poverty reduction, my definition of sustainability would be quite radical than just prolonging the time that we can exploit a resource so we can, you know, create surplus and export it and generate wealth for the longest amount of time possible. So I mean, that's my way of saying I do not believe that there could be a single definition of sustainability.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is originally when it came out of the 80s in the Brundtland Report, the attempt was to balance environment, economy, and equity. But what was happening, and I think it was pointed out by others, is that the concept has been so co-opted. There was often an economic framework that contained the other elements, and they weren't really being sort of addressed. So I think a lot of the concerns moving forward, given that a lot of the plans and frameworks around Agenda 21 weren't properly adopted, is an attempt to sort of rethink how those sort of what used to be talked about as the 3 E's to be approached differently.
I don't like the term sustainability either. I don't really use it except when I have to in this context. When I think of it as sustainability, what I'm really thinking about are things such as the following. How do we prevent catastrophic climate change? How do we reduce the rate of extinctions of plant and animal life? How do we reduce the level of pollution of oceans and land and air as well? Oh, sorry, yes, I'm sorry about that. I'm just suggesting that for me, sustainability is really divisible into a number of very specific goals, such as climate change, reducing extinctions, reducing levels of pollution of ocean, air, and ground, reducing deforestation, dealing with energy and water shortages. Specific things like that is what I would deal with, rather than this notion of sustainability, which is such a vague and very general term.
I would just add that that I agree with Hayden in that these are often context specific, and the notion of sustainable development goals that accommodate the global population is I think a bit extraordinarily far-fetched. But what we were talking about values and the issue of the value of how do we reach decisions that meet the goals, I think that Richard has highlighted. One of the evolutions of the notion of sustainability is to emphasize the procedural part of it, and that we often ignore the process that's required in order to reach some context of resiliency or some notion of sustainable development. And other writings about sustainability, and ones that I certainly emphasize in teaching, is that there's an important procedural element to this which fits in the democratic process, and that if you can't reach any notion of sustainability in a context or global scale unless you have a process which is open to deliberation and debate about what that is, which gets us back to the problem of pragmatics of how long do you debate and what kind of process do you want.
How many of the 17 principles and 109 targets deal explicitly with animal agriculture? Because it's not the ring that unites them all, but it's an underlying common thread to a lot of the apocalypses we're facing, beginning with climate change, energy usage, freshwater despoilation. I mean, the litany is long, and I haven't looked at the principles, but I'll be happily surprised if it deals explicitly with this, because, you know, I mean, there's at one level agencies which refuse to acknowledge the problem of climate change, but there's another problem, which is people who acknowledge the problem refuse to acknowledge some of its underlying causes. So I guess I want to come back to the moose, really, because to really solve this fix we're in, we need to hear from the animals directly, even though they can't speak articulately. We have emissaries now of the animal world who speak for them. But so if the answer is none, I guess that's a short answer to the question of the 17 and 109. But I guess we could maybe open up the discussion to this problem if the answer is no. Yeah.
I was going to ask Mitu if you wanted to comment on where the place of. I mean, I know that the goals talk about biodiversity, which is a rather large, hollow reflection of a whole host of animal, plant, and other vegetation, but I don't actually know whether animal species, mammalian or otherwise, are articulated in the SDGs?
No,
They're not.
No.
No, but I think the point is very important. I think the issue around loss of biodiversity, most have seen the report was well presented. David Miller was on the news the other night speaking about this perspective from the World Wildlife Fund. The drop in populations animal is extraordinary. It's somewhere in the order of 50 to 90% over the last 40 years. There's no evidence that that's going to change. So it's an interesting, we get tied up in importantly in the questions of where humans fit and what we're doing. But yet we celebrate these minor victories of the blue whale population is no longer, on the border of extinction, but is that somehow a victory? But I think your question is very important about connecting the non-human.
So I think there is one of the SDGs is sustainable agriculture, right? I think it includes cattle ranching and so on. And then I noted your sarcasm about being an emissary for animals. Okay. Oh, okay. No, I'm not saying I'm an emissary either, right? There's a debate about this in Anishinaabe society, but I think the kind of predominant debate is, we do not, we're not sitting down with the moose and talking things over. And talking things out, though some do believe we can communicate through SEMA or tobacco. The point is that it really kind of matters little what the moose or the deer are saying to us, but it matters that we have this philosophy and embedded in our lives that we're conscious of our actions and the consequences on other creatures and on the land, and then adjust our behavior as such. So whether we can literally communicate with those species is not really the point of the point that I was trying to make. It was the underlying philosophy that guides our relationships with those creatures. Yeah.
I'm Debbie Fong. I used to work on Bay Street. I'm an investment professional, but because I love the environment, so I left the industry to get into sustainability. My question is about individual accountability. I go to environmental talks and I hear speakers talk a lot about national policies, what politicians can do, but I very seldom hear them talk about individual accountability. Most of us, if not all of us in the room, can actually adopt plant-based diets. I know you meant one of the speakers at the speaker at the far end talked about sustainable animal agriculture. I contend that it's debatable whether it's truly sustainable when animals are involved. In fact, there is at least two organizations. One is a well-fed world that uses strictly plant-based food to feed hungry people. And United Nations back in 2006 made a statement, a global shift towards a vegan diet is vital to avoid fuel crisis, world hunger, and the worst impact of climate change. So I'm just wondering what it would take for speakers, Al Gore included back then, to even now, to openly encourage so-called environmentally minded people to seriously think about adopting plant-based diets to help minimize the footprint that we will leave on the planet.
Well, I have the microphone here, and I guess I'm going with this theme of killing and eating animals. But for me, that relationship with the animals underwrites my entire philosophy and the entire philosophy of the Anishinaabe or the Mushkegowuk or the Haudenosaunee into the present. And I don't know, I mean, there might be 40,000 years of evidence that indicates that it's a sustainable lifestyle. So I can't answer that part of your question or even agree with it. But for non-Indigenous peoples, what is it going to take to get them to realize that there needs to be significant shifts, like eating plant-based diets for many people? I'm not sure what beyond what we already know. I mean, any thinking, reading person can recognize the extreme situation that we're in. You know, somebody called it a number of apocalypses. I mean, there was a report from the London Zoological Society that 40% of the world's wildlife is gone over the past 40 years. Where animals, or sorry, water is not, resources are not replenishing themselves at the rate that we're taking them out of the land. So that should be, you know, enough of a wake-up call to people. But beyond that, I don't know.
It's interesting that you said many people know. You may be right, but at the same time, many people still don't know, because I go to very low environmental talks. I find those talks to go to. Some of them are held in like local churches or very small local communities and so on. Many people still don't know. But my question, my point is, for those who are connected to the environmental damage caused by animal agriculture, if we don't start talking about that openly, many people will continue to not know. And also for those people who do know, is it time for us to challenge them? Are they really doing everything they can to help the environment? For example, there are so many environmental groups like 350.org. Sorry for naming any particular one, maybe I should not have named anyone. So many environmental groups will condemn, like Line 9, condemn, let's say, Nestle for taking water and so on. It takes on average 8 to 10 times more water and 8 to 10 times more fossil fuel to produce one unit of animal protein versus 1 unit of plant protein. So I recognize that Native people or Aboriginal people, it's not fair for us to expect them to go plant-based, because they cannot just, like us, go to a supermarket close by to buy a bag of lentil or something like that. But for most of us, if not all of us here, if we don't take the extra step to really minimize the footprint, who will then? We're already in this room thinking about sustainability. If we don't talk about it more openly, when is a good time? By the way, I find it very ironic. WWF actually supports animal agriculture, and animal agriculture has been identified as the leading cause of loss of biodiversity. Tiger extinction, elephant, all these animal species that potentially go extinct have a lot to do with loss of their homeland. And animal agriculture plays a significant role in that.
I would just say that I think you're underlining a philosophical and an extraordinarily complicated global inequality issue. So in this context, in the city of Toronto, yes, we could advocate for healthier eating as an avenue towards trying to reduce meat consumption. But in parts of the world, for example, in East Africa, people aspire for income so that they can acquire a healthier, broader diet, which includes meat-based protein. So, well, no, of course it does not have to, but we're getting to the same argument about, well, at what point do we say, well, China, India, Brazil, yeah, I'm sorry you didn't carry on in the development process as fast as we did, so you need to stop, catch up. I mean, this is the global differentiated responsibility argument at large. So I'm not arguing it has to be. I'm suggesting that this isn't as simple as promoting animal-based or plant-based agriculture, because these are deeply rooted in values of societies, and they're also deeply rooted in people's aspirations for what are considered to be healthier eating. And we could have a whole month-long discussion about the food system, the structure of the food system, the corporatization of the food system. So I think your point is excellent and it's important. But you're right, we're not going to solve it here. So
my name is Andrea Paris. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Guelph. It's nice to see you, Richard. I have two questions. One is for Cheryl, one is for Richard. My question for Cheryl follows from Chris's comments about cities and the relationship between the local and the global, and actually ties in nicely to the last questioner's comments about local groups. And I'd like to hear more from you because you do research on kind of climate activism in cities. And I wonder if the new SDGs have any space in them for local actors, sub-state actors, cities, municipal governments in promoting the change, or is it still a very state-based framework? My question for Richard is, you talked about the importance of the primacy of the political over the economic, and I wonder if you could break that down a little bit more concretely, let's say within the Canadian context or elsewhere, but what does that mean, the primacy from a policy perspective? What would it take to return to the primacy of the political over the economic? Thank you.
In terms of your question about what's sort of happening at different levels, there are definitely a fair number in Toronto, a fair number of grassroots organizations. Sorry. There's a fair number of grassroots organizations that are taking on sort of post-carbon Toronto. There's a fairly active transition town movement across Canada that's engaging with sort of notions of resilience and how do we prepare to sort of change our lifestyles. The concern is that a lot of these fall under sort of mainstream environmental groups, so they tend to be predominantly white and middle class. So the issues of how to move towards sustainability or environmental justice or climate justice in other organizations tends to be taken up more in terms of everyday livelihood concerns in community organizations as part of concerns for, transportation, other sorts of things. So they get framed differently. In terms of other organizations that are engaging in it, I find that public health seems to be really sort of taking on concerns for climate change fairly actively in terms of almost all of the regions across Metro Toronto have some sort of strategy in place in terms of preparing for climate change. So as Chris says, there's been a fair amount of initiatives sort of locally in a lot of different urban centers. It's just that they tend to be sort of in silos and not connected to what's sort of happening at the national level, which is so invested in terms of concerns for energy resources and the fact that that's sort of our bread and butter. So on the one hand, we're actually sort of focused on exporting oil and gas. On the other hand, at the local level, there's a lot of concerns about sustainability and climate change.
Okay, so on the issue of political primacy and what does it mean in practice, I think you can see the difference if you compare the situation in Canada now, for example, to what might be the case. In Canada today, with a neoliberal government in power, the role of the state is primarily as facilitator of market forces. So the idea that the market should be as self-regulating as possible. The primacy of politics is rather a different view. The view is that if markets left to themselves create all kinds of problems. It's partly a Keynesian view that in fact the neoclassical economists were wrong in believing that a self-regulating economy, market economy, would lead to equilibrium. In his view, it would always lead to disequilibrium, and therefore there had to always be a directive role for the state. So the change is really quite dramatic from a situation in which the state, which is thoroughly democratized, sees its role as serving the common interest by constraining and channeling market forces rather than simply facilitating market forces. I think that's the basic distinction I'd like to make.
Hi, so my name is Phil. I'm a student of politics and governance at Ryerson. So I think we've had a lot of discussion here about the kind of both interconnected but also highly contextual nature of sustainability and how that relates to development. So I wanted to actually talk about these SDGs more and open up a discussion on can we at all use them to properly address all of these issues that we've discussed today? And if not, what other levels could possibly address all of the major issues? There's one issue on my mind in particular that I would like Hayden King to speak on, but I invite anyone else to speak as well, and that's the production of energy, specifically in Canada around the Alberta oil sands, but also the up-and-coming Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. And I suppose Canada's obsession with drilling into the earth for resources. So how do we combat that? I don't know if combating it is the right word, but how do we reconcile that current systemic inevitability with these really broad SDGs that are like desires for the future that haven't quite been quantified yet?
So what other level? So I think that the UN is an appropriate level for states to discuss these issues and try to bring them back to communities. And I mean, regional organizations, certainly if we embedded the SDGs in bilateral trades or the World Trade Organization, maybe you'd see some progress, but I just don't think states are seriously considering any of this, to be honest with you. Some maybe, but this is a declaration, as opposed to a convention. So declarations, as Mitu pointed out, are aspirational. So states, might consider implementing them. As for your second question on the tar sands and the Ring of Fire, I don't think that there are inevitabilities. Actually, I think that the primary investor in the Ring of Fire is now gone. That was Cliffs. They've left. They're selling their stake, and one of the reasons they're selling their stake is because First Nations in the north are hard to bargain with, because those communities are not interested in destroying ecosystems for short-term jobs in the mines. And the tar sands, I think, are increasingly under a lot of intense pressure, primarily by Dene and Cree First Nations, with a lot of environmental allies. Not to say that the tar sands are going to shut down tomorrow, but if there's limited demand from the Americans, if there's no way to export the oil to Asia, you'll probably see a reduction in extraction.
I think the potential importance of the Sustainable Development Goals is simply to build a global consensus on the kind of world we want to create. Now, many people will not agree with that consensus for sure, but I think that over the period of the Sustainable Development Goals, 10 years, these goals will become taught in primary schools, secondary schools, talked about here and there. It's part of the whole process of normative change, I think, that we begin to understand what is really important before us. That's how I see these goals.
I would just add that we've talked often about the problems at the United Nations, and for all of those problems, I think I follow from Richard's observation that we have to recognize that the UN has also done some remarkable things. There is a climate change agreement. When I started university, climate change was a concern, but it wasn't yet formalized as a point of discussion. And now there's a regularized process of tracking, monitoring. The Millennium Development Goals had very tangible measures, metrics, and there's lots of problems with metrics and indicators, but states felt obligated to report back on their progress on those things. So, well, how well is their progress and how well is their monitoring? Those are obviously important, but that the fact that they embedded this norm that you should be aspiring for X, Y, and Z actually held some fire or feet to fire to try to make sure that states were cognizant of that. And I'll point out that for all the failures of the Canadian government to do anything, both conservative and liberal, about climate change, the absurdity of how the original goal of 6% below 1990 levels was reached. I'm sure most of you have heard this story, but the U.S. said they were going to do 5%. Chrétien heard 5. He said 6. And this is well documented. CBC Archives has this. And then everyone in Canada, his cabinet included, was shocked and surprised. But Chrétien, everyone thought this was wonderful. But that 6%, it's stuck, right? It's the thing that has been measured through time over in terms of Canada's goals with respect to climate change. Now, as problematic as it is, it's a number, and it's something. And it embeds something in the discussion and the discourse at the international level, which local societies, groups, national governments can use to try to enforce. So it's problematic. The processes are often exclusionary, but it's something. And if we can get somewhere to have some tangible goals that have some values embedded that do resonate with the population, then it's certainly, in my mind, better than absolutely nothing or continuing to talk.
Virginia Mills, and my question is, what do you think is the future of this movement towards divestment of individuals and organizations and universities like Ryerson, for instance, divesting of fossil fuels? Is there hope for that? Will it be a new South Africa?
Well, I just want to thank you for the question. I teach politics of the environment, and last year we talked about divestment, and one of the things I asked students is if anyone knew where Ryerson's investments are and what are they invested in. Now, if I teach the course again, I think it'll be a class assignment, perhaps. I just know that the divestment movement has been catching on quite wildly across the United States. There are groups on most campuses in Canada. If you look at Twitter, Facebook, or you search on the internet, most universities have a divestment group. I do not know, and hopefully someone in the room can correct me, a student perhaps or otherwise, that Ryerson, I do not think, has a group focused on divestment. Now, we do? Creating one. Okay, well, there you go. Now, I would just say that it's a fascinatingly important area of investigation, whether or not it actually produces the outcomes. But students have been driving this, and universities have responded, which is, as everyone knows, the local, when it pushes hard and protests and becomes engaged politically, has the capacity to change. Now, whether you agree with that as a method, that's open. But the fact that it's happening, it's being led by students, just like other movements that have taken place in the past. So I think we're only on the cusp in Canada of the divestment issue. I don't know whether at U of T I know they have a divestment group, but I don't know what their success is. But maybe others can, hopefully we'll have a conversation in a year and we can tell you more.
It should also be noted that the Rockefeller Foundation, surprisingly, is going to divest itself of its fossil fuel.
Just the brothers, not the foundation.
Well, even that is rather remarkable.
So I'll just note that we have about 5 minutes left. There's a question at the front here. And if you have a question, then in the last couple minutes, then just let us know so we can wrap up in time for some food.
I'm Helmut Burkhardt, Emeritus from the Physics Department at Ryerson. And I have two questions to Chris. One is, I think the previous question of primacy of politics over the market forces included, how do we get to that situation? It would be desirable, but how do we get there? In Canada, it will be very difficult, and I think in the United States even more difficult to do that. My second question is about sustainability and growth. I think that is an oxymoron. Growth is the opposite of sustainability, and I don't like the term sustainable development because that sort of excuses a lot of the growth advocates. And we have to be very careful. Growth economy, growth of population, all the growth is not a sustainable situation.
Well, on the question of how one moves towards a green social democracy in a country like Canada, or especially in the United States, where the population in the US is so heavily polarized, obviously it can only happen through a well-organized grassroots movement. And something of the nature of, for example, the campaign against for nuclear disarmament in the 1950s and 1960s, which was very powerful. Or, you know, we did have the climate marches a few weeks back, at a very large one in New York City. So I think that the road ahead is not one that can be won through conventional party politics, where you go out and vote for a party that seems more likely to fit your needs. The constraints on politics now, in increasingly a politics governed by money, they're very hard to deal with. So I think that to break through this kind of situation, you do need to have a great deal of grassroots movement.
I would just echo that. I think it's very important to unpack the notion of politics, and I think Richard's observation is really important. Mike Layton was, the councillor Mike Layton was at lunch today, and one of the things he mentioned is the problem with transit is that politics overruled the technical expertise, which showed exactly what should happen. But I think it's important that that's not what Richard's not referring to, formalized political systems or decision makers, because they can really mess things up. It's about the notion of politics as a collective action. I think that's so important. There's a question here, and maybe we'll take the last two questions. Oh, three. Okay, last three, very quick, and then take them all at the same time.
Hi, my name is Adam Monta. I'm from Ottawa, and my question has to do with the tension we were talking about earlier in between the role of the United Nations as a largely state-based organization and the grassroots on the other level. And my question, if anybody can just generally speak to it, is what role there might be for corporations. I mean, regardless what people may think of corporations, especially larger corporations, economies of scale are what they are, and is there a role maybe for corporations to engage in sustainability as a cornerstone of corporate social responsibility by demanding responsible energy or sustainable food production or other inputs from suppliers, especially to the extent that we were talking about divestment and there is a market for ethical investment out there, and what might that role be? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jörg Wittenbrink. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Politics here at Ryerson. Thank you, first of all, for the really inspiring remarks that I have so much bubbling in my head that I would love to comment on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just ask a question. My observation is that a lot of the attention has been put into, you know, through mechanisms of trying to actually mitigate climate change, has been put into trying to internalize externalities of our capitalist production into the calculations for that. What we haven't done in an era of globalization is recognized how the rich countries of the world have externalized the pollution to the growing economies of especially East Asia. And you know, the climate calculations that, you know, places in Western Europe pride themselves on are really false if you take, you know, if you do a consumption understanding. What are the prospects of actually including, you know, a consumption-based calculation for these climate budgets? That's my question.
Oh, it's working, okay. Hi, my name is David Herzog, and I'm a third-year Ryerson student. I'm writing a research paper on sustainability, specifically with corporate sectors and the apathy they have towards considering the environment. So my question is, does the ambiguity of conceptualizing sustainability with its multidimensional forms of it, you know, through the environment, national parks, and also inequality between people, does that influence the apathy that large corporations, as mentioned earlier, in the financial sector, when they display that? Does that influence their lack of concern through an unoperationalized concept of it?
Thanks. Maybe we could start with Hayden, and Hayden, could you reply and say any closing comments? Because I know that we're almost time up.
Sure. I think that to answer your question, or to try to answer part of your question, I think maybe there's a role not so much with the corporations themselves, and probably not with the Syncrudes and the Suncors of the world, but we're talking about divestment. I mean, parallel to divestment is shareholder activism. You know, individuals are interested in you know, not having their money go to fund oil sands development or mining, then they can say something about it. I mean, that goes, you know, there were a couple comments about individuals. I mean, as an instructor here at Ryerson, you know, if I look into where the money goes, where my pension is invested, I can guarantee you know, double digits are in natural resources. So in shareholder activism, individuals can probably be a parallel model of action or method of action. And I think I'll just end it at there and pass it.
I guess in response to a couple of the questions relating to corporations, there's a fair amount of green capitalism happening, because people feel good if they're consuming what they think is green products, right? So there's that end of it. You know, some of the work in terms of the energy sector, you can look at clean tech businesses where their goal is to go in on the technological innovation end and to try and do some social enterprise work in that area. You know, but then if you bring it back to the concerns of sustainability and some of the initial ideas that is uniting this discussion today, issues of inequality then tend to be sort of reduced when you're really putting the business side of it first.
I think I'd just like to say that the problem of climate change and of sustainability more generally is primarily a political problem. And it's a matter of organization. We actually know what we have to do, what has to be done in general terms. We have all kinds of reports now by hundreds and hundreds of climate scientists who come to a consensus. And it appears that business as usual, with everyone doing the best they can within the existing order, is not going to be enough. So we need to develop a new kind of political system that can carry forward a more fundamental change.
I would say yes, absolutely. Corporations must be embedded in the system. They're already responding. Insurance companies, for example, the rates for communities or anyone that's more vulnerable, the payouts that they're doing for flooding continue to escalate. Hurricanes, natural disasters, flooding in the city of Toronto. I mean, insurance companies know more about climate change than most corporations, and so how do you turn them into activists would be a very interesting question. Yes, I think the problem of the ambiguity of the term is a huge problem. And so the question is, what kind of tangible or goals do you set, or advocacy? And I would just say, Jorg, I don't think so. I don't think the externalities are going to be anytime soon, because I don't think you're going to find a regime of any kind that can be agreed upon. But there's a rather large dinner crowd at the door, so I think it's a really valuable time to take a break. I want to thank first the audience for listening, for asking such engaged questions, and for engaging in the debate, and certainly a big thanks to the panel for your comments.